Okay, it is 6 o'clock, so we're going to get this started. Welcome to this University of Missouri St. Louis Speaker Series event from UMSL Global. My name is Evie Hemphill, and I'm a producer for our local talk show at St. Louis Public Radio, St. Louis on the Air. Our radio station is a public service of the university, and I'm really glad to be a part of this event tonight. Tonight marks the second in a series of presentations that comprise this year's Dr. Edwin Feder Lecture on Foreign and International Affairs. Dr. Feder was the founder of UMSL's International Office about 50 years ago, which is now called UMSL Global. This lecture series honors his legacy and seeks to carry on his pattern of bringing good information about the world to the UMSL community and beyond. Dr. Feder knew how important deep global understanding is for all of us. And in keeping with that search for good information that will deepen our understanding of the world, I'm pleased to introduce several special guests tonight. Our speaker will be Major General Corey J. Martin. He is the Director of Operations at United States Transportation Command. That command is based right here in the St. Louis region at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. But Major General Martin's responsibilities extend internationally. He and his team have played a very key role during the recent evacuation of civilians by the US military in Afghanistan. We're also joined tonight by Liane Constantine. She is the Executive Director of UMSL Global. And finally, we have with us tonight UMSL Chancellor Kristin Sobolik. One quick reminder before we get started, we do plan to save some time at the end for audience questions using the Q&A tool following the presentation. So feel free to send those along as you think of them, and we'll try to get to lots of questions following the talk. Do use the Q&A tool, not the chat box, for sending your questions. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Chancellor Sobolik as she welcomes our speaker tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, Evie. I appreciate that. And I really am sending a welcome to Major General Corey Martin for coming here on this evening to join us to talk about a very timely issue. I'm also pleased that this is hosted by UMSL Global, that really does a great job of making sure that we remain engaged and focused on all things, not just here in our St. Louis area, but also all around the globe. So thank you a lot, Liane, for helping host this as well. So welcome to everybody. This is a timely topic, and I'm very excited to hear what Major General Corey Martin has to say. I want to talk just very briefly about UMSL and talk about our military connection, and it all feeds in. But as many of you know, the University of Missouri St. Louis is a young institution. We're 58 years old, 50 years of international education, as Bob L's background indicates. And we're taking our place as a leader in the region and nationally. We are the premier public research university in Eastern Missouri and Western Illinois, and we're ranked as a Tier 1 national university by US News and World Report. We've moved up 42 spots in the US News and World Report's lists over the past 2 years, and we are now ranked number 118th in the nation. But as an institution, we are very engaged with our veteran and military community, and we have created a very strong network that is centered around our Veterans Center. In fact, the Military Times has ranked UMSL first in Missouri on its 2021 Best for Vets College list, and we are ranked number 37 nationally. And that indicates 7 consecutive years in a row that we have ranked in the top 50 in the nation. So we are very proud of those rankings and in the programming and support structure that we have built for our veteran and military connected students and their families. We're also engaging strongly with the National Geospatial Agency, the NGA, which is expanding here with a new $1.7 million facility, which is termed MGA West. And during the recent NGA INT symposium held here in St. Louis last month, I signed an educational partnership agreement, an EPA, with Vice Admiral Robert Sharp, who's director of the NGA, that will expand the work of our geospatial collaborative located in T-Rex, right below the Moonshot Labs. There are only 4 institutions in the nation with an EPA, with the NGA, and we're one of those. And in addition, we have a CRADA, which is the Cooperative Research and Development Agreement with the NGA as well. There's only one higher ed institution in the nation that has both an EPA and a CRADA with the NGA, and that is UMSL. So we have long worked well with veterans and with the military, and we are continuing with our NGA partnerships. We definitely welcome more engagement and collaboration with Scott Air Force Base, and I look forward to talking more with you, Corey Martin, on this and with the rest of our UMSL leadership team. So I hope that you can come to our campus again and take a tour, and we can talk about increasing our collaborations. So that's a big welcome to General Martin, as well as the rest of our community. And with that, I think, do I turn it over? I'll hand it over back to Evie.
To me, actually. And
oh, sorry, Liane.
Sobolik, in the interest of time. Thank you, Chancellor Sobolik. Thank you, Kristin. It's my great honor to introduce Major General Corey Martin this evening with some highlights of his career that we don't want to miss after the short introductions here before. Major General Martin was commissioned from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1991 with a bachelor's degree of science in aeronautical engineering. He has earned his wings after 12 months of undergraduate pilot training at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. General Martin went on to become a command pilot and racked up over 4,200 impressive flying hours. In addition to conducting combat airdrop missions to support our ground troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, he has flown the following aircrafts: the C-17, the C-141, and the C-5 transport aircraft, the KC-135, the KC-10 refueling aircraft, and also the E-3 aircraft that is known as AWACS, or the Airborne Warning and Control System. He has even piloted the HH-60 helicopter, and not to forget actually the helicopter is used for search and rescue and medical evacuation missions, for those who are not familiar with the HH-60 here. But my favorite aircraft, I don't want to forget, that is the F-15. And of course, General Martin flies the F-15, I guess, passionately from what I can tell. So in addition to that, and especially here as we are as hosts or hosting as a university, General Martin has earned a total of 4 master's degrees on top of his bachelor degree, and on top of all those flying hours, and on top of a very busy career. So in addition, and by my calculations, General Martin has moved about 14 times and has deployed 2 times to Baghdad in Iraq and to Manas, Kyrgyzstan. He served as a defense attaché at the US Embassy in Tel Aviv, more recently in Israel, for 2 years before arriving at Scott Air Force Base here in the region in the summer of 2019. For the past 15 months, General Martin has served as the Director of Operations of the United States Transportation Command, USTRANSCOM. In this role, he is focused on transporting people, supplies, and equipment around the world for wartime, peace, and humanitarian operations for the US Department of Defense. Given the global breadth of the United States military, General Martin's job has been very busy during calm times. And it was during his already high operations tempo that he and his team oversaw the evacuation of over 120,000 people from the Kabul International Airport during just 2 weeks this past August. I could go on and on and on, but in the interest of time, let me just say that General Martin, thank you so much for joining us this evening as the second speaker of our FEDER speaker series. The season's theme is helping our local community understand who the Afghan people are that are arriving here in the United States and in the St. Louis area, And I find it outstanding that we have the opportunity to hear directly from someone who has played such an impactful and influential role in helping protect so many Afghan people who have supported the United States during the past 20 years. So with no further delay, General Martin, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, Liane, thank you for that wonderful introduction. The part she left out is that Liane and I were neighbors about 10 years ago, and we were both in Okinawa, Japan. I think it's one of the wonderful parts of kind of the small world that the military can be. So it's great to see her in her new position. So thank you. And for Dr. Sobolik, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I commend you for bringing the Federal Lecture Series and to talk about Afghanistan. And really to those that are tuning in, thank you for having an interest in Afghanistan and all its facets, to include many Afghans that will be our neighbors in this area soon. I will admit that I did not take much of an interest in Afghanistan before September 11th, 2001. My only recollection prior to that is kind of the Cold War era, and knowing that it was known as kind of a graveyard for Soviet aviation, and being a pro-U.S. teenager, I appreciated the fact that the Soviets had stumbled in Afghanistan. But that's about all I knew about Afghanistan until September 11th, 2001 kind of reintroduced it. And so my plan tonight is to just kind of talk about how I have been associated with Afghanistan over that 20-year period. For anyone that is maybe probably about 27 years old or older, I would guess that you have a memory of September 11th, 2001. For me, I was about 10 years into my military career at that point, flying the C-17 aircraft, one of the aircraft that Liane had mentioned, in Charleston Air Force Base in South Carolina. And the C-17 it's a 4-engine large transport aircraft, really to deliver soldiers, mainly our Army, anywhere in the world. And we can do that by landing, or we can do that even by just dropping people or equipment out of the airplane while it's still flying. And I had just finished up a week of that training, airdrop training in the C-17 before September 11th. And so that Tuesday was a recovery day for me, a day off. And I was on a run in my neighborhood with my wife, and with the technology of the day, she had a Walkman on her arm and was listening to music via the radio. And in the course of the run, said that an airplane had flown into a building in New York City. And being a pilot, I tried to picture how that's possible. I imagined very low-hanging clouds in New York City, a private airplane, and a pilot that got lost and ran into a building. So we continued to run, but a few minutes later, she said it happened again. And so we went immediately back to our house. And of course, like the rest of the world, when we tuned into the news, we saw just the opposite of the weather. It was a beautiful day in New York City, and it was not a small aircraft. It was large aircraft. And immediately I knew there was something nefarious that was involved with that. So I put on my uniform and went into my squadron. And so there were a couple weeks of time where our government was formulating a response. And so that response would manifest itself with Operation Enduring Freedom that began on October 7th of 2001. And it was an opportunity to find the Taliban and Al-Qaeda that were in kind of the ungoverned parts of Afghanistan, and be able to bomb them and strike them. But in the lead up to it, at least according to Bob Woodward's book, Bush at War, President Bush said, this is not a war against the people of Afghanistan. It's about the Taliban. And so we needed to find a way to make sure the people of Afghanistan knew it was not against them. And he wanted, in his words, bread to be dropped along with the bombs. And so on that opening night, about an hour after the first bombs were dropped, I was on the second of two C-17s that were flying formation into Afghanistan to drop humanitarian aid. And my one prop for the night is just, I'll show you, it was the packets. Humanitarian daily rations. Over 30,000 were dropped that night southeast of Kabul, and that mission continued for about 2.5 months. But it also just was a start to a new relationship I had with Afghanistan, and continuing to fly to places that you've probably heard of: Kandahar, Mazar-e Sharif, Bagram, Kabul. So that was 2001, and it seems like about every 10 years in my career, I had another meaningful interaction with Afghanistan. And so the next was in 2011, when I was a neighbor with Liane. I got news that I would command a base that was in Kyrgyzstan, just outside of Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And so I actually, in 2012, went to command that base. That base's focus was twofold. One, it had the C-17 aircraft again, bringing primarily soldiers in and out of Afghanistan. And it also had the KC-135 aircraft that she mentioned, an air refueling airplane about the size of a domestic airline, but with a lot of fuel in its belly and its wings, and a rigid hose that it could connect to another airplane. So in flight, it could transfer fuel, and that other aircraft could stay airborne longer without having to land. And that was a mission that daily was flying over Afghanistan with our forces there. And then two kind of significant things that happened. And one, a good, happy story, one not so much, that I'll just share with you. The one is that during that time, the environment, the threat environment in Afghanistan was such that we actually were able to put our KC-135s and eventually land them and keep them in northern Afghanistan and Mazar-e Sharif. And it was the first time that those aircraft were able to operate from that location on the ground, which was a positive thing. The other I need to mention, because it highlights the sacrifice and the connection many American families have with Afghanistan, and that is that one of our KC-135 aircraft broke apart while it was flying a mission to Afghanistan and crashed in Kyrgyzstan, killing the three crew members. And so I just acknowledge those two men and one woman who I just flown with a few days before that accident are three of about 24,000 combat losses that America had in its time in Afghanistan. And so that was in that 10 years in, around 2012. And now you go a decade later, we're at 2021, and as mentioned, I'm at Transportation Command. And Transportation Command really has a global mission that it will deliver our servicemen and women, our soldiers, our Marines, our sailors, our airmen, soon our Space Force Guardians, anywhere in the world at the time and place of our nation's leaders choosing. And we do that with air, with sea, with land transportation. Right? All that is under the purview of Transportation Command. And so if something has to be there literally overnight, Transportation Command aircraft are able to do that. Or if a much larger, what we call a decisive force, has to be delivered, Transportation Command can do that as well. And what that would look like is if you have a base, maybe like Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, Colorado. If that unit needs to go to Iraq, they first will load up their equipment on rail cars, and by train will go to a port, maybe like Beaumont, Texas, or Charleston, South Carolina. There, they'll get off the rail, and TRANSCOM soldiers will load it onto a ship. And these are enormous roll-on, roll-off ships that can carry about 400 C-17s worth of equipment, and then make the trip across the Atlantic and into Kuwait. They'll download that equipment, and that equipment can drive into Iraq where it is needed. Or if it is needed overnight, an airplane like the C-17 or the C-5 lands at that base, Fort Carson, loads up much fewer pieces of equipment, but then can fly it much quicker direct. So it's kind of an ability to do something immediate tonight or a decisive force over time. And in the question and answer, if you have more questions about Transportation Command, I can discuss that. But in light of that, that is why Transportation Command was called on to help in Afghanistan this year. And there's really two parts of Afghanistan that I'll talk about. Liane mentioned the most well-known, and that was the non-combatant evacuation operation. But before that, there was a retrograde of our forces out of Afghanistan, colloquially called Go to Zero. And it was President Biden's direction to get our combat forces out of Afghanistan. And that happened between April and the end of June of this year. And it took that deliberate piece of Transportation Command to kind of do the reverse of what I just talked about. 20 years worth of equipment and presence in Afghanistan slowly was brought down to zero. So beyond some of the places I talked about before, the Kandahars and the Bagrams and the Mazar-e Sharifs, which were fairly large bases, there were many forward operating bases. Those would collapse, and they collapsed back onto Bagram. And then eventually, on the evening of July 1st, the final C-17 aircrafts left Bagram and had really brought our military presence to Afghanistan to zero. All that was left was the diplomatic presence at Kabul, in the capital of Kabul, and some military security focused on protecting and securing the embassy. And we were able to do that because the international airport, Harman Karzai in Kabul, was still operating. And so we would be able to continue to supply our diplomats through that airport. But many people thought it was either likely or inevitable that at some point our diplomatic presence might have to leave, mainly because of threats that the Taliban had given to the country of Afghanistan and the Afghan National Security Forces. So while many people thought it was likely or inevitable, and we'd been planning for that eventuality, I think few people saw it happening at the rate that it did. And so I was not expecting in early August that the non-combatant evacuation operation would begin. But at TRANSCOM, where it became very clear to me that it would begin, was on Thursday, the 12th of August. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, called to TRANSCOM to make sure that we had the aircraft, we had the aircrew, and that we could bring a security force, a combat force, back into Afghanistan that would be sufficient to allow for the evacuation. And once he had that assurances that that Transportation Command would be able to provide that airlift, the next day on the 13th of August, we begin to flow combat forces back into Afghanistan for that purpose of giving us security of the airfield. There was an urgency to do that. And I don't know if I fully appreciated the urgency that the chairman had at that time, but it became very clear. And if you remember in those first days after, around the 15th or the 16th of August, the images that came out of Harman Karzai International of thousands of Afghans being able to access the airfield, certainly not a safe environment to operate aircraft or to try to do an evacuation. What might be less clear is while the news continued to show some of that loop footage for days afterwards, really in a couple days, the situation had changed. The 82nd Airborne, some Marine units had arrived. About 5,000 U.S. forces had arrived. They were soldiers, there were airmen, there were Marines, there were sailors, all on the ground, giving security to the airport so that at that point, the evacuation could start in earnest. And for the U.S. military, it was the C-17 aircraft primarily that was used to bring evacuees out. Very challenging environment. We did not know the number of total evacuees. We would show up, there would be thousands that had come through the gates, had been prepped for flight on the aircraft, and we would take them out, and the next day, thousands more, and the next day, thousands more. And we did not know when that stream of individuals would come. But again, there was an urgency to take them out of Afghanistan because of the threat. The Taliban had quickly taken over Kabul. There was additionally, as you know, a threat from ISIS. And even on the 26th of August, you saw the materialization of that ISIS threat with the bombing that happened just outside the gate in Kabul. And so it was imperative to get those American citizens, legal permanent residents, those that had been granted special immigrant visas, and Afghans that were at risk because they had aided the United States over 20 years of our time there. Thousands of individuals that had to leave in a short period of time. And a C-17 is not meant to be a people carrier. If you were going to try to move thousands of people out of a location, you would much rather have as you're familiar, like a Boeing 777 or a 747 that can take 300 or 400 people at a time out. But the security at the airfield did not allow commercial aircraft, a U.S. commercial aircraft, to go in. So the C-17 was used. C-17 would normally carry about 100 people out at a time. We can put airline type seats in and get that number around 150, 170 at a time. But clearly that was not going to give us the speed, the velocity we needed to bring the thousands of people. What ended up being, for Transportation Command, over 80,000 for the entire operation, over 120,000 individuals out. And so what the C-17 crews did is they just had 400 to 450 people just sit flat on the floor of the aircraft and fly them out that way. And there's actually a fairly iconic picture, at least in military circles, of over 800 people that were on board a C-17 aircraft where it took them to safety. So that was the C-17 part of just getting individuals out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible. It introduced another challenge, though. When you're bringing one day 20,000 people left Kabul, where do you take them? This was a surprise on the timing. And so, as you know, with Afghans that are eventually going to come to St. Louis, there's a journey that took them from Kabul to America. And some of those, we were not ready to take 20,000 a day into America. And so there was some staging bases that were needed. And this is where I think it is so important that a country like America has allies and partners, that it has partnerships, global partnerships. And there were several countries, 10 different countries that said, we will take Afghan evacuees and we will allow them to stay in our country for a temporary period of time while we are able to get the flow into America. And so I'm very appreciative of allies and partners and their contribution to this operation. Clearly not just a United States operation. In total, about 30 nations were involved with either bringing their own citizens or other Afghans at risk out of Kabul, or helping to host either permanently or temporarily Afghans. So that one part of the challenge was finding those spaces, and as countries stood up, that was helpful, a bit of a relief valve, a place that we knew that we could bring the evacuees as they left. But then we needed more transportation help. The C-17s, at the height of the operation, the United States Air Force has over 200 C-17s. On a normal day, maybe 60 or 70 of those are being used. At the height of this operation, well over half of them were being used just for operations that were happening because of the Afghanistan evacuation. And there was still a mission that we had around the world. We still had to continue that mission. And this is where industry partners, which are critical partners with Transportation Command, these are airlines, some that you're very familiar with, American and Delta and United, and some maybe you're not, Omni and Atlas and Hawaiian Air, that they made aircraft available to be able to take the evacuees kind of that last part of the journey into America. So anyway, there's much more to the operation. To the point that you're interested in other details about the operation, certainly can talk about that. But I've been in the Air Force 30 years. I've seen several operations, many challenging operations. I don't know if I've seen one quite as complex as this one, with the number of variables and the number of constraints. Knowing that there was a timeline of when our access to Kabul would end, knowing that there were actors around the airport that wanted to damage U.S. aircraft, U.S. personnel, Afghans that were leaving, and then the constraints of multiple countries and needing to get people all the way back in the United States. A very complex situation. And I'm really just able to talk about in all three of those kind of episodes I talked about, the start of Operation Enduring Freedom with the initial airdrops, this, my time kind of in the middle when Afghanistan was about halfway through our war there, and at the end about the mobility story. If there was a soldier talking who had spent several years potentially on the ground in Afghanistan, they would have a different perspective. If you talk to a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot that was over Afghanistan and dropping bombs, they would have a different perspective. But I appreciate the opportunity to at least give you one perspective to let you know how the U.S. military has been really deeply involved to the point of thousands of lives lost in trying to protect the Afghan people. And so as I saw the end at the 20-year point, I reflected a little bit on on the first day, a C-17 was bringing that humanitarian aid to the displaced people of Afghanistan and bringing it to them. And then in the end, in the final chapter, it was C-17s that were bringing the Afghan people to the aid. And soon that will be neighbors here in the St. Louis area. And so for those that are local, thank you for what you will do for the people of Afghanistan. I would say ask them their story. Ask them their story of how they got to Afghanistan, or they're born and raised in Afghanistan. Ask them their story of how they got out of Afghanistan. I know some of the Afghans, it was the first time that they had ever been on an airplane when they were put on the floor of a C-17 and brought out. It was a new experience for some of them. There were babies born on the aircraft, babies born in flight on C-17s as they were coming out. There are a lot of stories. So I would encourage you, just as I've tried to help you understand at least part of the military relationship with Afghanistan with stories, that you would allow the Afghans to do the same. So I think in the as I'm looking at the clock, I want to leave an opportunity for people to ask questions. Again, I can go deeper into any of those areas that I talked about. The one area I'll say I don't work policy. So as far as the policy decisions surrounding Afghanistan, I cannot help you with or really speak to. In my role as a director of operations, we put that policy into action. So I will be happy to talk about any of that part of Transportation Command or my experiences with Afghanistan. So I think, Evie, I'll turn it over to you or to Liane for question time. Thank you.
And as first say, that has been an excellent introduction and opening the floor for us here. We have, just before we start with the questions, to give you a feeling who is here tonight. So we have a fantastic audience. Thank you everybody for joining us. We have one student here, one UMSL student who is from Afghanistan. Actually, she joined us last time. So welcome, Hila. I know you can hear us. We have professors from our university, from other universities, and we have a lot of local people who are interested in the topic. And as such are the questions here. Before we start reading and relaying the questions out to you, maybe Chancellor Sobolik, I wanted to promise you to give you the chance to ask a question back first, if you have one.
I am taking a look at 14 questions now, and I'm very cognizant that I took up more than my fair share of time. So I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful audience.
Okay, wonderful. So Evie, I hand it over to you. You can just go in the order they came in.
Okay, there are so many great questions here. We will start with Linda. Linda asks, can you share what is being done now to get the rest of the Afghan collaborators and families and American citizens out of Afghanistan?
Yeah, to a certain extent I can, Linda, and that's a great question. And I should have maybe even clarified it in my remarks, that although the Department of Defense was very deeply involved in this evacuation, it's the Department of State that really has that role. And if it exceeds the Department of State's capabilities, which in this part, the Department of State would contract some of those commercial aircraft that I talked about. And because of the threat environment, that was not going to be possible. The Department of State asked for Department of Defense help. And so we were involved in that surge of getting people out. Now that we have officially left Afghanistan, and that last aircraft that departed on the evening of 30 August, it really is back to the Department of State to help work those American citizens that are still in Afghanistan, some of which are there because they did not want to leave. They are because of maybe not everyone in their family would have been able to leave with them. They chose to stay behind. But here's the critical part of an airport like Harman Karzai staying viable, is that after that 30 August date, there have been other American citizens, special interest visa holders that have departed from Afghanistan, and to my knowledge will continue to be able to depart from Afghanistan. And again, Department of State led process of getting them back to the United States. From the DoD perspective, those 80 plus thousand Afghans that our aircraft brought out and kind of entered into the system in countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Germany, and for the most part, they have all left those. I think there are still just a few that are left in the Persian Gulf area that are still making their way back to the United States. So that will complete the evacuees that the Department of Defense brought up, but there will continue to be a stream of American citizens able to leave Afghanistan. So I let you know that it's happening. I can't get you the details just because at this point that is a process that the Department of State is running and not the Department of Defense. But thank you for that question, Lynn.
Kind of on this similar note, General, Hila, our student, asks, were the evacuees Afghans who had aided the United States or civilians who had no connection with the U.S. as well?
Okay, and so I'm gonna answer a little outside my lane, but I think it's all of the above, Gila. And so certainly American citizens, special interest visa holders, legal permanent residents that had paperwork that showed that they had a pathway to America. And then to your next question, yes, on both accounts. There were thousands of Afghans that had helped the United States and its allies while we were operating in Afghanistan, and that help was invaluable to have that local help. And so, yes, the United States wanted to honor that and bring those families out. But there was also a category that I heard the president talk about: Afghans at risk. So they were not necessarily Afghans that had direct connection to helping the United States, but because for 20 years there had been a different environment for certain parts of the Afghan society to flourish. I think of females in particular to have opportunities that potentially was going to go away under Taliban rule, that there was a desire of the U.S. government to bring some of those at-risk individuals out as well. So again, I don't have precise information on that. That was outside of the scope of the Transportation Command, but just from what I'd heard in the meetings and even hearing the president talk, I know that was kind of the breadth of the population that was brought out on our aircraft. And again, 29 other countries had aircraft that brought out a smaller group of people than the United States, but also I think we're doing similar demographics of Afghans. Hopefully that's helpful, Hila.
Thank you. Well, turning to more of the operation itself, we have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do you train for a people evacuation operation like this of such a huge scale with such a limited timeline?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so the term that we use in the military often, and maybe you see it when you look at military news, is readiness. Are we ready? Do we have the equipment that is needed? Do we have the personnel in the quantities that we need them? And do we have the training that is required? And so training, just as I mentioned in those days leading up to September 11th, 2001, I was doing training to drop soldiers into from our airplane in a country. That is not something we do that often, but there have been times in our history where that was needed. And so we train for that. So we have training and we have exercises. And so we can exercise a non-combatant evacuation operation. And so, yes, we do have opportunities to train for that. For the part of like floor loading individuals, that really is something that we know can be done, and we save for contingencies. This was done within the United States, like after Katrina. We floor loaded a lot of United States citizens out of Louisiana to other parts of the country because we had to do something in mass. So there are things we train specifically for, and then there are things that we know are within the limits of what our crews and our aircraft are capable of doing. And when needed, leaders can give the authorization that we can do some of those non-standard loading procedures. And so that was very non-standard. But we start to look at risk, and we realize the risk of leaving individuals in that Kabul area versus the risk of having them sitting on the floor of an airplane for maybe 2 hours when they flew to that next intermediate base. The risk of not floor loading was greater than the risk of floor loading. So those are the kind of the decisions that go into that. But yes, there are opportunities that we try to think through the full spectrum of things that the military can be called to do. And we take opportunities to train or exercise to that, even if it is not something that we're doing commonly on a day-to-day basis.
Well, kind of following up on that, Haitao asks a great question. What opportunities do you envision data analytics and AI, artificial intelligence, can help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of U.S. military transportation, logistics, and operations?
Yeah, Haitao, you're looking into our crystal ball and our future with that question, because we are not where we need to be yet. And this operation highlighted that. Our ability to have what in the military we call a common operating picture was lacking. So we were still doing too much communication person to person, either in a video, several people like we are right now, on a video screen with several people, or point to point calls, when technology would allow that data to be shared almost immediately with everyone, to preclude some of those man hour, woman hour events of trying to establish, did we have the right number? What was the number of passengers that came out on that plane? And everyone had that information. So as far as just basic data usage, we can see immediate improvements we need to make. And as far as artificial intelligence, machine learning, the military as a whole is definitely looking into that. Transportation Command is interested in that as well, because it can take a much greater amount of data and at least present potential courses of action. Our intent is always, there would be a decision maker in the loop, but they have all those options laid out in a much shorter period of time. So if you're asking how much it was involved in the operation, very little. But this operation highlights where we would like to improve in those areas.
Great. We have a great few questions actually from Jim Craig, who leads UMSL's Veteran Affairs. Jim has a couple thoughts here, and I'm going to go ahead and read that. Jim writes, I wonder if you could speak to the non-uniform talent needs that TRANSCOM has. And are you finding that talent in the workforce of the region? Also, if you could identify one or two key competencies that colleges and universities could focus on developing in graduates to address your needs, what would they be? That's from Jim.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I wish I had the number off the top of my head of the percentage of civilians that are at Transportation Command. But it is probably, it may be close to 50%. There's a large population of civilians, and I can talk, specifically about Transportation Command, but really, I think generally I can talk larger about the U.S. military. And there is, for instance, as Liane was reading my bio, she talked about 14 moves, and there's a part of officer development, enlisted development that really values a diversity of experience and forces frequent moves to where being in a job or a location for maybe 2 to 3 years is about the maximum time someone is in a location, and then they move on to a different location, different job. There's value in that. There's great value in that diversity and coming in and not getting kind of into a rut of groupthink and thinking a certain way. What you lose with that, though, is some continuity. And so sometimes you may have experienced a new leader comes in, they have an idea, and you think, well, we tried that 3 years ago, and we know that that didn't work. The civilian workforce oftentimes does not move at that same frequency. And so there's great value in the continuity and the depth of experience that they bring. And so that's why I think, especially at headquarters, combatant commands like Transportation Command, you will see a large number and almost a balance of both civilians and uniformed personnel. As you go lower and lower echelons in the organization, down to like a flying unit or a tank unit, you'll see that percentage go much larger to uniformed personnel. But so great value and great usage of non-uniform members of Transportation Command. As far as yes, for opportunities. Anyone non-uniform that's interested in government work, Transportation Command would be interested in having you come out and see if your talent would fit with Transportation Command. Your key competencies piece, I kind of in with the last question, cyber. The pieces of information technology. There is a need to accelerate our ability to integrate that into our processes. And so I really think there's value in skills that capitalize on that help decision making. One of our commander's 5 priorities is advanced decision making. How can we make decisions quicker? And it's oftentimes because we can leverage those types of tools. So anyways, Jim, thank you. And thank you for being part of the Veterans Affairs at UMSL.
Continuing to get some great questions. We're going to turn to a slightly different topic, General. This is Richard. He writes, will Scott Air Force Base and TRANSCOM be able to assist the efforts to resettle Afghans in St. Louis and the Metro East?
Okay. I don't know what role Scott Air Force Base is going to have. So a little bit about, if you're not familiar with just Scott Air Force Base. So there is the base itself, and the unit level of the Air Force that usually operates a base is called a wing. And so there's a wing, the 375th Air Mobility Wing, and that commander commands Scott Air Force Base. On this base, there are 2 commands. There's Transportation Command, there's Air Mobility Command. Both have a 4-star general that runs that headquarters. They're not the base commander. There's still a colonel that is the base commander. And so I'm not familiar with what role the 375th Airlift Wing has planned to play. So I cannot answer that directly, but I will let you know that from being a wing commander myself, both overseas and in the United States, there is a necessary connection with community. The community, it works best when the community embraces the base, even though there's this transient nature of people coming for maybe 2 or 3 years, into your schools, into your churches, and then leaving. But communities embracing that, and then the base really turning around and embracing the community and finding volunteer opportunities to go. And so I know that the 375th Airlift Wing does a lot of community outreach and volunteering. What I don't know is specifically if they have any plans for helping with the relocation of Afghans in St. Louis. But the wing commander only lives a few houses down from me, so I will next time I see him, I will mention that we had this opportunity and that question came up. So thank you, Rich.
Okay. Mark writes, what preparation had to happen in order to generate the tremendous number of aircraft for the evacuation? How many bases provided aircraft for the support?
So your question kind of gets a little bit at the heart of what Transportation Command does. The four-star in charge of Transportation Command right now, it's General Jackie Van Ovos. She has what we call operational control of all the C-17s. So even those C-17 aircraft, the 222, are spread around the United States, spread around the world. She has kind of ultimate control of where those aircraft are going to go. And she delegates that authority through me as her director of operations. And so we were able to make aircraft available for whatever the highest priority mission is. It's really kind of the heart of when you hear people talk about command and control. Command and control is taking scarce resources and trying to put them against the highest priority missions. And the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff made it very clear to us this was the highest priority mission on August 13th. And so Transportation Command, the first step was making those aircraft available to our Air Operations Center that does the more tactical, technical piece of actually scheduling a takeoff time, coordinating for diplomatic clearances for countries that a plane has to fly over, or arranging for an air refueling of a tanker aircraft with one of the aircraft in order to accelerate, or medical evacuation with doctors and nurses on board the plane, which was used during this operation. That command and control, scarce resources against the highest priority mission. So that is what allowed us to mass C-17s where they were needed. I do not have the exact number of bases that were used. However, it's a chance to highlight that if you're not familiar with the military, there's an active duty component of the military that is full-time in the military, in the uniform service. And then there is Guard, and there's Air Force or Army Reserves, other services. So Reserve and Guard do not necessarily wear the uniform every day. They may be, in this case of aircraft, they may be airline pilots. They may be working in a hospital. They may be owning a business for most of the time, and then they will come when needed and fly. And I will say that in addition to the active duty bases, whether we're talking about airlift aircraft or air refueling aircraft, there were Guard and Reserve members that were involved as well. So several bases made aircraft available for this mission. And the C-17 got a lot of publicity because that was on the ground at Kabul and on a lot of the news footage. But the other aircraft, C-5s, were continuing to fly elsewhere in the globe to keep those missions going on. The air refueling aircraft were above refueling fighter aircraft and bomber aircraft, the AWACS airplane that Liane referenced earlier, aircraft that stay airborne to give surveillance and be able to keep kind of a camera on the airfield all at one time. All those aircraft were able to be in the air above Kabul, even though you never saw them because of air refueling aircraft. So, in my mind, countless number of bases were involved, Mark. So I don't have an exact number for that, but Transportation Command's authorities is what made the aircraft initially available to be tactically tasked where they needed to go, where they were needed the most. Thank you.
General Martin, you just explained some of the aircrafts very nicely. And I, as you know, I was like kind of a late comer to the Air Force as a spouse. So I remember your three kids explaining all the different types of aircrafts to me when they were very young. And in that regard, we actually have two really interesting technical questions for on the C-17 that I'll summarize. So one of the questions is, did any of our C-17 come under fire by the Taliban or any bad actors during the evacuation operation? And the second, tying in with that, can you describe how the C-17 aircrew aims a pallet of food to land precisely in the right spot on the mountaintop? So these are two technical questions, I thought.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for the first question, the threat to the aircraft was more from, during that operation, was more from what we call indirect fire, rockets or mortars that are fired from some position off the airfield onto the airfield. Fortunately, those are relatively imprecise weapons. And fortunately, there are weapon systems on the airfield that can detect those inbound rockets and mortars and attempt to shoot them down before they get to their target. So more of the threat for this operation was that indirect fire than it was from what would be anti-aircraft artillery fire. So that's the first question. For the second question, so there's a few different delivery types. I talked about delivering those food packets on the opening night of Operation Enduring Freedom. The intent of that delivery was to spread those 30,000 packages over a large area, 2 or 3 miles. And so they were released without parachutes and just released into the air and just naturally separated and floated down. That is a kind of the most basic type of drop. But you are correct. There were times where we needed to get either food or ammunition, water to a precise spot where we wanted to get it to our allies or our forces and not allow a Taliban force to have that. And so that is a combination of looking at meteorology, knowing what the winds are, knowing the speed of your aircraft, knowing how fast or slow the parachute drops. And then also we have some pallets that have global positioning satellite technology that will deliver it to an exact location. So the best way to do it, to know you're going to hit a spot, is to have some kind of a global positioning satellite signal that takes it right to a coordinate. That is relatively new technology. For most of my career, that technology did not exist, and yet we were able to get pallets within 50 to 100 meters of the location where we wanted to drop it, just knowing what the winds were, how the parachutes were going to react, what the weight of the object we were dropping. So there's a variety of ways to deliver, but the most precise is to use that GPS technology.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Major General Martin, I've got a two-parter here, and I know we're getting close to time here, but maybe there's one of these two prongs you want to go for with this one. What kind of coordination with our NATO allies was involved in the evacuation? And or what do you think some of the biggest lessons learned from this evacuation operation were?
Okay, thanks. For the coordination with NATO, I can talk a little bit operationally. Again, I don't have insight into some of the policy pieces. When we first arrived, when I mentioned the scenes of thousands of Afghans being on the airfield, the Harman Karzai was still under control of Turkish forces. But soon after that, it transitioned to U.S. military control. We have what we call contingency response forces that have a wide variety of skill sets, and they are actually part of Transportation Command. They have background in maintaining aircraft, fixing aircraft, being maintainers. They have background in fueling. Some of them have background in air traffic control, and so they controlled the airfield, and I forget what date that transfer happened, but relatively soon into the operation. So they were not just allowing U.S. aircraft to come in and land. They were allowing aircraft of all nations to come on, but there did need to be coordination. there was a limit to the number of parking spots that were available at any one time on the field, and so there had to be a coordinated arrival. But no way did the U.S. take all of those spots. They made sure that really all nations had an opportunity to come in and bring their personnel out. And Evie, I forget what the second question was. I'm sorry. Can you say it again?
So
It was lessons learned. I wrote it down. Yeah, I wrote it down. It was lessons learned. So one, I think I covered one already that we're looking at, and that is how we can better use information technology, a common operating picture, use technology to be able to know what we call kind of in-transit visibility, that we know how many people are on each plane. We know where each of the planes are. We know which locations. Does Germany have space for more Afghans to come in today, or does Spain have more space for Afghans to come in today? So I think one of the lessons learned is, trying to get more real-time awareness of some of that. And the other, I think I covered also, but a lesson that I think at Transportation Command we kind of know, but I don't know if outside of Transportation Command it's as obvious. A lot of people think that, hey, as long as you have enough C-17s or whatever aircraft you need, you're going to be okay. It's all about just numbers of aircraft and aircrew. We quickly found out it was more than that. It was almost more important to have what we would call a node, some place outside of Afghanistan that we could put the airplane, that we could put the passengers on that aircraft. And so that, as you're trying to, have greater throughput and velocity, oftentimes it's the nodes, it's the places and the people with the expertise to keep the planes going. That is what was as important as just having airplanes that were available to show up in Kabul and load up personnel. So I think really, we're doing a larger, what we're calling it, what the military often calls an after action report, where we go back to look to see what went well, what went poorly, and we're working through that. But off the top of my head, those are two that I think lessons that came out of the operation.
Thank you. And we're going to fit in one more here. More questions we didn't get to, really good questions. But Manusha writes, would it have been possible to evacuate more civilians if we had started earlier or pushed the deadline to winter? Or would that have put servicemen and women and civilians at greater risk? That's Manusha.
Yeah, great question. It's kind of another one where it's yes to both. And even if I don't talk specifically about this operation, in an operation, more time gives you more options usually. And so you can either decide to do the same number of things at a slower rate, or you can do more in the time period. So oftentimes more time helps. In this instance, there was a feeling, again, I'm not talking from a position of being part of the policy, but really just somebody that was able to watch the news and see what our national leaders, our president, our secretary of defense was saying, is that there was a feeling that there was a period of time that after which there would be more threat to not only the U.S. actors, but the Afghans on the airfield. And so, yes, there was a consideration of at what point, beyond what point, would we be incurring more risk or not? So anyways, yes, time usually is a friend. More time allows you more options. And in this case, we just knew, for whatever reason, the policymakers gave us a deadline. And so as operators, we worked within that policy to maximize the number. And there were individuals leaving up to that last day of still drawing Afghans out, even as we had to be concerned about drawing our own people and equipment out.
Well, in the interest of time, I'm looking at the time here. We're 4 minutes overdue, and I didn't want to overstretch General Martin's time here for sure. I would like to thank the audience, all our participants today, for your Great questions. And if I may, General Martin, I take this as a fantastic introduction into more, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity maybe in the spring for a meeting in person with you. I appreciate your wonderful feedback. And I would like, before I hand it back over to Evie for announcing our next speaker event, I would still like to use the opportunity for a big shout out to our military spouses who help carry the mission. And I have seen several here on the call. So hi to all fellow military spouses, especially the ones that have husbands that are still in uniform, like General Martin here. And I would also like to thank our Chancellor, Kristin Sobolik, to join us here tonight, and all of you for logging on and helping us with this wonderful discussion. Back over to you, Evie.
Thank you, Liane. And with that, we'll conclude tonight's program. I too want to thank our speaker, Major General Martin, for joining us along with our audience. And thank you to the University of Missouri St. Louis and UMSL Global for putting on this enlightening event. And as a reminder, we do have another speaker coming up this month as we continue this focus on Afghanistan. You can join us again on Tuesday, November 16, that's next Tuesday at 7 p.m. as we hear from Paul Costigan. Paul is the Missouri State Refugee Coordinator for the International Institute of St. Louis. And he'll be discussing the opportunities and challenges associated with resettling the Afghan diaspora in St. Louis. So mark your calendars for that upcoming presentation as well. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, General Martin. Good night, everybody.
Hi, Doctor.